Greetings, audio bros! Welcome to Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of latest episode of Marvel television. Hawkeye is at halfway point, and shit is wild, bro! All right. Enough with that. But look, Hawkeye is going wild. So are we here at the Marvelous TV Club. As you know, there are a lot of podcasts that talk about Marvel TV. But what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we creatively structure our conversations. Last week, Christine, Jesse, and I dove into the characters of Clint, Kate, Eleanor, Jack, and more. This week, our Storycast team is back to explore the themes of both this pivotal third episode and the series to this point. I'm your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti. And as always, on Storycast, I am joined by our two story experts.
I'm Amanda Marcotte. I'm a senior politics writer at Salon and a giant fan of Mark's Russian accent.
And I'm Maeve Adams, associate professor of English at Manhattan College, where I also direct the Digital Arts and Humanities program.
We got a lot of good action in this episode. Maeve, did you have a favorite arrow from Hawkeye's quiver?
I'm going to say it's the suction cup arrow, but not because it's as awesome as some of the other arrows, but because it demonstrates how little they care about the physical probability that these arrows are going to do what they're making them do, right? Like there's the arrow that comes out of the front of the car and grabs all the Christmas trees. It's like, how does that arrow control not, launching those tethers forward and grabbing things that you don't want it to grab, right? The suction cup is definitely not going to keep them from flying off that subway car.
That's true. That's true.
But I'm into it. Like, lean into the ridiculousness and the improbability, the physical improbability that these things are going to work the way that the imaginary universe of a superhero show wants us to imagine them.
Who knows what metal compounds exist in the Marvel universe that we don't have? The arrow might be just, titanium, adamantium alloys and whatnot, right? Like anything's possible, right? We can't really question the physics of a universe where they have, nanobots and all kinds of other things already at this point. Amanda, did you have a favorite arrow?
Yeah, the exploding one that Clint fires off on the Manhattan Bridge. Not just because it explodes, though that is a very cool one, but because it's Pym technology, not Stark technology, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, Hank Pym used to not want anyone else to have any of his stuff. Now apparently he's handing it out like candy. That's cool. I guess, we've come a long way in trusting issues with our Hank Pym. But a lot more than arrows happened in our third episode. We met Echo, who is the woman at the top of the tracksuit mafia. We got her backstory as a deaf child, and I honestly can't believe how much some of those scenes with her dad got me rooting for one of the bros. We also got some strong signals that one of our character cast theories is right, that the mysterious uncle she had sure sounded a lot like Vincent D'Onofrio's Wilson Fisk. Clint breaks free from the mafia, but not before Echo trashes his hearing aid. Meanwhile, he and Kate then have a series of those wild arrow-based combat scenes with all the tricks we were just talking about. There's a heartbreaking conversation between Clint and his kid Nate, and finally a hearty meal at a diner with Pizza Dog. At the end, they return to Kate's crib to look up even more on the tracksuits, but Clint is held up by Jack and the Ronin sword, and that is where we left it. So, loads of action, but is there more under the surface? Let's start with you. Amanda, was there a theme or a main idea of this episode, specifically this episode, that jumped out at you?
I was really captured by the tension between the authentic self and the roles we inhabit. This is very common in superhero stories, but I think Hawkeye is doing something a little bit more intelligent with a lot of it. It's really getting on something that I personally enjoy as a person, which is trashing the concept of authenticity. This has been a long obsession with mine, this notion that there's an authentic self and then there's all the roles and stuff we inhabit. Like all the psychological research shows that that's not true, that authenticity's a lie, that whenever you try to drill down into what it is, it always just kind of falls apart as a concept. And this episode particularly, was really exploring the idea that we become the roles we inhabit, for better or for worse. You become the thing you pretend to be. I mean, I think that's kind of built into a show where there's literally two people that can equally claim to be Hawkeye, and it's kind of exploring what that means. And this episode in particular really did a lot of work to think about how this notion that there's a true self aside from the roles we inhabit is not as true as I think a lot of us wish it would be.
I like that idea because it sort of sidesteps the nature-nurture debate, and it's more about it's more about the way we act in the world, and the actions that we choose to take become crucial to who we are and how we see ourselves.
Yeah, there's like a point where in the diner, actually, where Kate and Clint are talking, and Kate says, I think Kate is supposed to be, I think they do a smart thing on the show where both characters are right and wrong, depending. There's not one that's like the smarter or more accurate one. She makes a lot of good points. He makes a lot of good points. And in this particular case, she's spouting the typical cliches about how I'm becoming who I was meant to be. And he basically tells her, no, it's a choice and there's trade-offs like all other choices. And as an older person who is living one of those trade-offs between two different roles that he inhabits, I think Clint is speaking a lot of wisdom here, which is like, is he Hawkeye? Is he a father? He is both. And those two roles are equally true, but they are in tension with each other. And he's trying to tell her that this isn't you. And in a weird way, I know that what's funny about that is it feels so empowering. This is who I'm meant to be. But I would say it's more empowering to choose to be who you are.
Well, tell me more specifically about the roles that Clint and Kate are inhabiting in this. What are those roles exactly? And what do those roles say about the characters and what they're trying to accomplish?
Well, I think we're watching Kate go through the process of becoming Hawkeye, right? But they do a lot of fun stuff in the episode too with like her past, her 5 minutes of life as Ronin. They do a lot of stuff with the fact that Clint is a father, but he is also Hawkeye. I think that even Pizza Dog is a lot of fun that they've been playing with him. Like, he doesn't have a name yet. He's just Pizza Dog. Like, there's a lot of power in names. And this episode really kind of touches on that. By not naming the dog, you're kind of letting him be an undefined being in a lot of ways. You can't just let the dog manifest his personality. Dogs don't name themselves, right? I think that nobody names themselves. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. I think there's also a lot of interesting kind of discussion going on about what Hawkeye-ness is. Like, there's the fun bit in the diner where Kate is drawing the cartoon of Hawkeye's costume. And the joke is that it's the old Hawkeye costume. And Clint's like, this is too flashy. And it's clear that Kate likes the flashy, and she thinks that's a way to interpret Hawkeye as a person, as a role. And like, both are equally true. I think it's a lot of coolness going on about how authenticity is a trap, that there's so many different ways to define a role and inhabit a role and become a role. And I'm not saying that every role is a good fit for anybody. Like Kate, her mom wants her to be like this like automaton who works at Bishop Security, and she's rejecting that. But again, she's trying to reject it from a place of like, that's not me, instead of thinking more carefully, like, I choose not to be that. And I think that difference matters a lot.
Do you think there is something here also about stuff that may be not simply chosen, but innate? Because I think there's something about the way that Kate imagines a drive to be something that's not something that she chooses simply, right? That it's something that she chooses because it helps her express something that she wants deeply, and that is on some level kind of, from her perspective, innate.
I think that's definitely how it feels. And again, I think that the show's more interested in exploring that tension than kind of falling on one side of the coin or another. There's so much of the dialogue between Clint and Kate where they're both making a point and both have a point, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I think that feeling can be I want this can be such a profound feeling that we can forget that we have agency in choosing. And we can also, I think, even more importantly, forget how much the roles that we inhabit, sometimes ones we didn't choose for ourselves, create those desires inside of us, right? We saw, like, Kate innately feels like a hero, but was she before that day that she had her life saved by Clint Barton and saw what a hero could be? Like, she wasn't born this person. She probably more than anybody has become this person.
Well, not obviously every identity is a choice. Maya doesn't choose to be deaf, for example, so it's obviously not black and white. I take it.
Yeah, no, obviously there's a lot about us that's innate, and a lot of us that's things like your sexual identity, often your sexual orientation, things like a disability, gender identity. These things I would say are to one degree or another innate in people. Then but none of these things exist in a vacuum. They always exist against the roles we inhabit in the world. Like, we both can believe that gender identity is innate, but also understand that gender is performance. That we create and write our gender every day according to social rules that are handed to us. So there's roles that we're given, and our choices within that structure, right? So I'm a woman. I feel this innately to be true, but I perform my womanness every day. I wear makeup, and that's how I do it because of that just feels right to me. But it's also true that it's because those are sort of our socially prescribed ideas of what womanness is. And you can challenge that and you can fight it. And I think there's a lot going on, especially with Maya's character, about how we can fight and rewrite the roles that exist in the world, that we can have agency. And so it's interesting because like Maya's deaf and the world has a lot of ideas about what disability means. And she obviously rejects a lot of those. Mm-hmm. She rewrites what deafness means. She sees it as a power, not not just a negative, tragic thing that happened to her, right? But by the same token, like the concept of Hawkeye is kind of there's a Hawkeye-ness, right, in the world.
Yeah.
There's things that we imagine Hawkeye is good at, swords and martial arts and shooting arrows. But Hawkeye can be a man or a woman. Hawkeye can be a gritty, like, guy who wears leather jackets, or Hawkeye can wear purple costumes and be flashy. There's like a lot of Hawkeye-nesses. And so there's agency inside these kind of set social roles, and how we kind of imbue it. So I like the fact that, like, it's fun to think about how a lot of the stories we tell ourselves in our culture about what is true and what is false are choices and social constructions, and not like as inherent as we think they are. So
yeah.
Did you see any symbolism about this that appeared in the episode itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun. The costume drawing was particularly a goofy moment for me. I thought a more serious moment was when Maya's talking to her father as a child, and she asks about going to the deaf school. And her father says that she can't, and then he spins it. He takes what is a negative, I can't afford to put you to in the deaf school. And he spins it as a positive thing. You need to learn to jump between two worlds. And you can kind of see that throughout this character. She's a person who takes things that the world says are bad, and she turns them into good or powerful things for herself. But also the concept of being able to code switch is super important here. And I think we're seeing a lot of characters who know how to code switch. Like, Clint can be a father at home and Hawkeye in the streets. Kate can be a daughter to her mother and Hawkeye in the streets, And
I suspect also that Maya is going to be a character who, over the course of her development in this series, and maybe, later in her own series, learns to code switch even more effectively. Because right now she's really resisting it, right? She refuses to talk to Clint in anything but ASL, and then goes through her interpreter, which I think is a striking variation on the way that her father encouraged her to be.
That's a really good point, because I think she and Kate have this in common too, which is they're both people that have reacted to, they're both young, And they're both people that have reacted to being told what to do by leaning on these narratives about inherency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that their growth is going to come from understanding there's like who you are, and then there's the choices you make in the world. And the latter are often going to be far more important because they define who you are.
Yeah.
And again,
and
there's
resisting.
Yeah.
And resisting the sort of the idea that we can be multiple selves, sort of leaning into inherency is actually, to use a word, a disability in this context.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of sympathy for Maya not wanting to speak to people in English. I totally get it. And that's a choice she makes, and it's a powerful one. But what's funny is it's nonetheless a choice. And it's one to defend, a point of view that she has chosen. And I think that if you think about it that way, it actually gains a lot more power than just kind of talking about her disability as an identity. It's part of her identity, but so is the choices she's made to express herself in the world.
Yeah.
Was there another work of film or literature that this episode and its themes reminded you of, Amanda?
So less that and more kind of, I find this discussion so fascinating because I think I grew up in the 90s, as we all did. And it was kind of the apex of the authenticity discourse in our culture, I think. There was a lot of, like, both gangster rap and grunge were about people trying to create an authentic self. But it was like getting rid of glamour. It was getting rid of glitz. It was getting rid of lights. It was doing all this stuff. But it wasn't actually more authentic than the glittery, highly makeup 70s and 80s. It was just another costume. And in a lot of ways, it was a trap because, first of all, it was so male. It excluded women. It excluded queer people. It was also a trap for even straight cis men who were in it. Like, I think of, the tragedy of Kurt Cobain, I think in a lot of ways was he got so caught up in this like bullshit concept of authenticity that he actually hit a wall because it's a lie. The further you keep peeling down further and further into it, and it's just more costumes, it's just more performance, it's just more of that. And he never, I think that was part of his struggle that you get in his suicide note was this belief in something that just simply didn't exist, right? And I think that the end of the 90s was such a relief because you have artists like Missy Elliott, Kathleen Hanna of Le Tigre, women, not surprisingly, who said, you know what, I don't like that. I don't like this rigid, fake authenticity because there's no such thing as like real authenticity. And instead you see like Missy has these amazing music videos where she's wearing costumes, she's distorting how she looks. Her lyrics often play with the idea of identity. And I think perversely creates a more true sense of what identity is, which is like a series of choices and social roles that we kind of go through in life.
Yeah.
So I think that when I think about this particular debate, I don't think of any particular work of literature, but I do kind of think of how this kind of played out in the music industry. And I think you can say the same thing has happened in comic book movies. Like,
oh, interesting.
Like, there's all these like Zack Snyder type movies, like try to substitute grittiness to make a superhero movie seem more real. But it's a stupid superhero movie where people can do things that are outside of the laws of physics. And I think one of the reasons we all like the Marvel Universe more is that they lean into that. Like you said, Maeve, earlier with the arrows, it's just some goofy bullshit. Like,
yeah,
it's magic. Like, who cares?
Man, you're really making me think about that musical.
Yeah, that's
which
true.
is just like, it's the representation of the singular self. I could do this all day, whatever. I don't know how they sing it, but it's this sort of this singular self, this sort of one-dimensional self, the leaning into the one-dimensional self as if this is fulfillment and satisfaction, and as if that is authentic. And whatever else is outside of it is not authentic, which is also why that interaction between Clint in the audience and Hawkeye on the stage is so moving, because he can't identify, because it's simply not an authentic self on the stage. And the idea of authenticity is itself a ruse that is kind of damaging and distressing to him.
Yeah, I mean, even Steve Rogers, right? Like, he's portrayed as like this guy who just loves being a superhero and kicking ass. And that was true. But it was also true that he got tired of it. It was also true that he wanted things that weren't that. He wanted other roles. Yeah. I think that's like one of the great things about it is like, we all like the what's made Clint a cool character in the show is like they really leaned into the idea that he has this tension between these two roles, and he wants to believe one is more true than the other, but he'll probably be happier when he accepts that they both have some truth to them.
And there's a third role for Clint too, of course, which is Ronan, which haunts the entire episode. There's Clint the dad, Clint the Hawkeye, and Clint the serial killer who, killed Maya's dad, and he's still running from. He claims that Ronan is dead, but even that's kind of a cop out. It's an interesting thing to think about authenticity in the context of Ronan as well.
Yeah, like Ronan is not dead when you think of Ronan as an authentic person, right?
Right.
But Ronan the role, Clint's at least trying to make him be dead.
He's trying to keep him dead, yeah. Unfortunately, Kate resurrected him against Clint's will. But our conversation, you were talking about, Amanda, around Maya and her dad, the idea of the deaf school and the real school, trying to jump between two worlds. It does tie into a theme that I saw, which was the reliance on crutches and the pain and problems that losing them can cause. Obviously, that speech about the two worlds was about Maya not needing to rely on signing to get through the world, at least from the dad's perspective, right? That's his belief. She clearly does something different, although she's very comfortable navigating the regular non-deaf world perhaps as a result of the choice to go to that school. It's unclear. I mean, that's complicated. But she also tells Hawkeye that his crutch is technology. And of course, she shatters that crutch, and she's proven right that he is overly reliant on it, and he struggles until he gets that hearing aid fixed. I mean, think of how heartbreaking that conversation was with Nate. And while Echo was able to navigate the deaf world and the non-deaf world, her dad was her crutch, I think. And she has been struggling not to lose herself in rage without his calming presence. And then, of course, Kate is muddling through without her credit cards and all those other things. So I see a lot of things in this episode that tie into that idea, which is also related to this sense of who you are. Because if who you are is narrowly defined, when some key pillar of that is knocked out from underneath you, you can really struggle.
I think that goes back. What's interesting is Kate has the credit cards, so she has the most obviously like privileged crutch. And yet she's the character who articulates most clearly the importance of choosing to inhabit new roles and take risks and to grow as a person from doing it, because Clint tells her all the downsides of being Hawkeye, and she's like, but there's so much to be gained. And she's right. I think one of the positive things about this kind of understanding of identity and roles is that we can gain so much by trying a new costume on, by being a different person, by trying a new role, a new job, a new hobby, anything.
Well, let's change gears a little bit, Maeve. What did you see as the main theme or idea of this episode?
This episode was particularly striking to me because it suggests that the show is something that we might think of as a non-romantic comedy. Okay. It's not unromantic. It's not anti-romantic. Because the show is simply uninterested in romance. It's sort of in the process of leaving behind romance or essentially erasing it from the show. It also interrogates some of the sort of more problematic features of the romantic comedy, right? Because the cisgender, heterosexual buddy comedy or dramedy with male and female co-leads almost always involves some kind of sexual tension. So you can think of, like, we talked about Nick and Nora last time. Mm-hmm. Think of Castle or Bones or Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I mean, there are lots of outliers, obviously. And one of the things that sort of struck me as I was trying to think of other examples of this was like that the British seem to somehow escape this particular trope, right? Like, think of Broadchurch. There's no sexual tension between those two characters, but this maybe is a particularly kind of American thing. And maybe it has to do actually with, stuff like box office returns. Because I was reading up about this today, and apparently there's been quite a bit of research about this, that when there's a woman in a leading role, movies make more money. And so shove a woman into a leading role or as a co-lead, and we'll pay for them on the screen, but only if they bolster our conceptions of kind of cisgender heteronormativity, maybe.
Yeah. And especially for women, because it's, always the marriage plot is kind of underlying it, right? Like this idea that whatever goes on with the female lead, she needs to be safely contained in the barriers of heterosexual romance or marriage. But it's not always marriage in a modern time, but still the idea that it makes people uncomfortable to see just a woman be single.
Yeah. Right. I really love that reading, because I've never heard anybody make that connection between the marriage plots of the 19th century and sexual tension in modern television, that it's a way of safely containing the professional woman, keeping her within the confines of a marriage plot that essentially endorses heteronormative bonds that keep women tied to the domestic space and to, maternal roles and all.
Did you see any crucial scenes from this episode that sort of jumped out to you as reinforcing this theme?
There was one moment that I think would be kind of easy to ignore, but really stuck with me. In fact, when I rewatched the episode, I kind of watched this scene a few times, because I was like, it just, it's hard to kind of ignore this moment where Kate and Clint are talking, and she refers to Maya's friend as the hot guy. And she's talking about, she's like, is there did you notice some tension between them? I don't think she's talking about sexual tension there. I think she's talking about, is there something going on there that's like, something going wrong there? But the hot guy part is interesting, because Clint responds to it simply by naming him, completely blowing past that whole hot guy designation. So Kate's effort to kind of introduce some kind of sexual dimension to their reading of all of the conflicts and dynamics between these characters, it's not of interest to the show. It's a sort of sign that the show is not interested. And I do think that's particularly striking, given what we talked about 2 weeks ago in the comic book. There's that whole page where Kate asks Clint, why you pick me? And he says, because I don't want to have sex with you. Well, but that's not really it. And it's this whole sort of confrontation of the problem of sexual tension. So the comic book is doing a good job there. It's just that here that gets manifested as a complete erasure of a convention of buddy comedy, buddy dramedy, where you have female male co-leads.
They do it in a different way, which is it helps that Clint is a father in this version of the story, because he just slots Kate into his daughter role, or like at least the friend of your kids role, right?
Right.
Like they do it surprisingly effortlessly. Like he's not interested, because he sees her as an actual child, and Clint is not a gross dude.
Yeah. I mean, there was a moment in the episode that I kind of threw me, where Clint and Echo and Kate when Clint and Kate are on the ponies or unicorns or whatever. And, Echo's trying to figure out if Kate is Ronan, and he says, she's like 9. And there was a moment where I thought there's an interesting dynamic that's happening here, where Kate is getting a little infantilized. Mm-hmm. And I like the fact that she really resists that. And the show also resists it. Mm-hmm. She's an authority on love, right? To the bro who wants to know how to handle this like fight with his girlfriend. So the show, I think, handles it in super subtle ways that are sort of hard to notice if you're not trying to pick up the pieces about the way that her relationship to Clint might infantilize her, might turn her merely into a daughter rather than into a mentee.
There was a scene in one of the earlier episodes too, where he says, what are you, like 18? And she says 22. And I think that very much underscores the idea that she is an adult
Yeah.
And he refuses to see her that way because of multiple internal reasons. But I think obviously what the show is heading towards, like that's the conflict, is he's coming to see her as an adult, but also reflects the parent-child relationship, because the parent does have to go through the process of seeing their child as an adult.
There is a lot about love in this episode, though, right, Maeve?
Yeah, what's one of the things that I noticed that I think is not that unobvious. I mean, I'm sure everybody noticed this. There's a kind of pairing of Maya and Kate, two characters who love deeply and have lost profoundly. They've both lost their fathers. In a way, Maya is Kate's anti-hero because of the way she lost her father, right? So Kate loses her dad in a way that is fundamentally unfair and unjust. But Maya loses her father in a way that is also unjust, and in a very different way because of vigilante justice, which is usually the kind of bread and butter of superhero stories, right? Vigilante justice is somehow justified along the lines of like there are bigger evils in the world. But here, that's not the way the story is told. Maya's loss is just as profound as Kate's. And I do think that, by focusing on the forms of love that emerge in the wake of loss. So this is the difference between Maya and Kate, that Kate seems to move forward in a way that is productive. She moves forward with joy, right? She's the one thing that makes her a youthful character that I think is not problematic is that she's a joyful character, seeking joy in the things that she does. And that joy includes love. It includes loving her mother, even though her relationship with her mother is complicated. It includes the kind of love that is beginning to emerge in her relationship with Clint. There is a kind of love there. There's an admiration for sure. The moment she first sees him, "You're Hawkeye." There's a kind of love there, and that love is turning into friendship, which is obviously a much more interesting kind of love. But I think the way that the show steers us away from thinking about romantic love to other kinds of kind of non-romantic bonds is important, because it tells us a lot about what the show cares about, which is, it's not about the kinds of hilarious romantic tensions that emerge in buddy comedies. It's about whole communities that are affected by loss and are maybe rebuilt by love.
Yeah, Nate and Clint too, right? Nate's and Clint's, the whole scene with them on the phone is, again, all about love that is nothing to do with romance. It's not opposed to romance. Nate came from romance, presumably, but that relationship is not that at all.
And Clint and his wife are the only romantic couple on the show, really. I mean,
we got Jack and Eleanor, of course. Rose in the mouth.
Jack. But we know that is not real.
That's not love. That's not love. That's manipulation.
Maybe, but by who? I'm not so sure.
Fair.
But they're shown as like an established romantic, a married couple. Really, they're they're at that point in a marriage where it's not in love. And I mean, they are in love, but you know what I mean? It's not
erotic.
Yeah. It's not the like hot blush of first love that we're used to seeing on screen portrayed.
Something that I've been dwelling on a little bit in the first episodes and was also driven home in this one, which ties into what you're talking about, Maeve, and the lack of romantic love and the episode stressing all the other kinds of love. And that is how desexualized Kate Bishop is. Her character is very much not designed for the male gaze. She wears androgynous outfits. They are often super baggy, even when they're her own clothes. She wears no visible makeup. I mean, it's a TV show. She's obviously wearing some kind of makeup. But blemishes are visible, and not just the cuts and scrapes on our faces. But when you compare her to Black Widow or even someone like Captain Marvel, who is also relatively desexualized, I just think she's the most gender ambiguous character maybe in the MCU's history. And, I think it's this really special thing that they are just moving away from this idea of everyone rocking the skin tight outfits and having, somehow pitch perfect makeup, even when they're flying around in galactic space or whatever. It feels like a character design that is also encouraging us to step away from this really narrow concept of romance as the driving force in a lot of these stories.
It's all the funnier, in an episode, obviously not this episode, but the first episode where Armand says to Kate when she's at the fundraiser, you better not show up dressed in a tuxedo to the wedding. And, a wedding where heteronormative gender distinctions have historically been codified, right? So she can't break, especially there. So fine, show up to this party and I'm going to make fun of you here. But Kate just resolutely stands outside those distinctions, those boundaries.
You also can't clock her sexual orientation, which I think is really interesting.
Oh, such a good point.
Like she could be straight or gay, and I would buy either complete or bi or whatever. I would buy any of those without blinking. And I think that that's unusual and something TV's only starting to learn how to do, because I think in the past, every character was straight until otherwise stated.
Right. And even though Kate refers to Kazi as the hot guy, that doesn't mean anything in the context of her sexuality. Anyone of any orientation could, refer to him as that. So yeah, I agree. Sure. They're definitely keeping that, off the page, which is cool. Maeve, was there another work of film or literature that this idea of non-romantic love that was driving this episode? Did it remind you of any other work?
There's a whole body of work that kind of falls under the heading of the sociology of love. And some of it, honestly, is really conservative. So there's this Talcott Parsons, who is fairly well known, writes about the way that love in modernity, because it stepped out away from extended kinship networks, those kinship networks kind of dissolve. And so we need romantic love in the nuclear family to provide a model for social bonds outside the family. So the family becomes a kind of model for the bonds that will bind us to people abstractly in large communities. Sadly, my one of my fave 19th century philosophers, Max Weber, is also in this canon. He argues that the sensuality of romantic love provides a model for the forms of empathy that allow us to connect at a distance with people who are in large communities. So there's that whole body, which I don't think that's pertinent here, but it's important to kind of recognize. There's another philosopher who many people will know, 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who writes a lot about Christianity, he writes a lot about faith. And I don't think the religious dimensions of his writing are necessarily relevant to this, because this is a seemingly profoundly non-religious show. But Soren Kierkegaard writes a book called Works of Love. I think it was published in 1847. And the argument of the book is that there's a form of love that is non-erotic, that is, and his sort of framework is kind of like something that's divine, given to us divinely. But this non-erotic form of love helps forge the moral connections that bind humans to one another, one individual to a human outside of themselves. I think Kierkegaard's kind of vision of this is like God loves you, and so you can love other beings that God has created. So it's a sort of divine connection we have to others. But I think we can think about this in other ways too, that non-erotic love does forge social bonds because it binds us to one another in systems of mutual respect, care, duty. And duty is a real key component for Kierkegaard. Our duty to one another as human beings who are deserving of love of a whole variety of kinds, including and especially including non-erotic forms.
Well, let's expand out a little bit. We've talked a lot about this episode, but the ideas that we're getting at here also seem like they might be driving through, or a version of them might be driving through the series as a whole. So Amanda, let's return back to your ideas. What have you seen as the thread running through these 3 episodes so far when taken together?
I'm going to circle back to the idea of identity, but a little bit different, which is like what I see in these first 3 episodes is this notion that identity is a process, not a fixed thing. And I think there's a lot of tendency in our culture to talk about, both on the right and the left, unfortunately, to talk about identity as a fixed thing, and not think about how actually it's a thing that happens throughout time and often with more deliberation than we often really kind of think of it. And it's interesting in superhero stories because I think that it's very typical in superhero stories to fit that model of thinking of identity as a fixed thing. So the superhero origin story is often this person is person A, something happens to them, then they become the superhero. It's passive. Peter Parker gets bitten by a spider, becomes Spider-Man. Superman born that way. Captain America turned into from Steve Rogers to Captain America through the super soldier serum. There's in those stories some choice and agency, or it wouldn't be a story, but there's still a sense that it's a fixed thing. You were one thing, you become another, and that is your identity. Whereas I think that Kate particularly is a fun way to think about identity as a process, because in the very first episode, we see her choosing to become a superhero and doing all this stuff to become a superhero. I don't even know necessarily thinking that was what her end goal is, but I clocked on the second episode her mom telling her, "You're not a superhero." And that's a fun joke for us in the audience because we know that she is. But is she yet? Like she's heading in that direction. But it's very cool because there's nothing about that. There's no spider bite. There's no super soldier serum. It's simply being a superhero because she chooses to be, because every day she is acting like a superhero. And I think that's kind of throughout this series, they're really kind of exploring the idea that these characters are fun because they're just human beings. And the difference between a human being and a superhero in this world is the process of behaving like one. And then there's also like Natasha, whose ghost hangs over the season. She was somebody who literally was built to be a KGB killer and chooses against it. She chooses to be a hero. And probably more than any other character is really in the MCU universe to embody this idea of agency and choice.
It's funny because Echo seems to be possibly another version of this. Somebody who, because of circumstance, has become bad, but it has rooted inside of her a goodness, a sense of justice and fairness, and that she's not all bad and could choose to be a hero too.
Yeah, I think she's in the D&D schema, she's a true neutral who might be heading towards good.
Yeah.
Where else did you see these questions pop up in the episode, Amanda?
Well, they have a lot of fun playing this out with symbolism, and I think probably the most fun sequence that does this is the LARPing sequence in the second episode.
My favorite.
Like, what an amazing way to really think about the process of identity. So Clint has all these developed skills, right? He can fight bad guys. He jokes about it. I fought Thanos. But in a completely different context, those same skills make him a very, like, you realize he could be a badass LARPer, and he feels really drawn to it too, because he's so good at it, right? I mean, he rejects it because his plate is already full, but you could definitely see Clint spending a few days at home with his kids and being like, I could LARP again. And I think more importantly, LARPing is like in any kind of role-playing game on screen, the whole point of it is to explore the idea of how fantasy is another version of this kind of this active role. Like role-playing itself is like a way of embodying roles and becoming a thing, if only for just a short period of time. The other thing I think is really kind of interesting and shows that they're doing this very much on purpose is that they play a lot with the idea of names, right? So it's everyone, like, and this again is very canonical in superhero stuff. You have your given name and then you have your superhero name, but this show plays with it a little bit more. Like there's this like amazing joke where Clint asks Kate what the dog's name is, and she says, it's Pizza Dog, but really it's more of a title than a name.
Right.
Which you could say is like also true of Hawkeye. And you're underscoring the like way that Hawkeye-ness, Pizza Dog-ness, all these things are being created. These roles are kind of being created minute by minute. The identity of Hawkeye or Pizza Dog or whatever is just sort of being generated by processes of living as Hawkeye, eating a lot of pizza if you're a dog, I think. He wasn't Pizza Dog till he got a pizza.
Yeah. And the funny thing too is that with Kate, it's also about, there's a geographical dimension to it. As she migrates between spaces, when she's with her mother, she's a daughter. And that part of her identity is crucial. And she's not her mother says, you're not a superhero, but it's also because she's not a superhero when she's there. She is a daughter. And it's an important component of the development of their relationship because her mother wants her to be safe. And that matters too, right? There's an interactive dimension to this.
And Jack is learning how to become a stepdad, right? He bought a book. So he's choosing to push himself forward. I mean, not really, probably not sincerely, but if we take Jack at his word, he's trying to learn how to, be a part of a family.
Mm-hmm. I will say that I was listening to another podcast about this where Joanna Robinson of The Ringer was saying that one of the reasons that they are so intent on showing Kate's training and they have it in the montage and they keep showing her trophies and crap and they just really hammer home how much she's worked for this is they're trying to bat off the fanboys who would inevitably be, that's not realistic that she could do all this.
Oh,
as if it was realistic that Clint could, right? They're right to worry about it. I don't know if they're right to focus on worrying about it, but it has the unintended or maybe intended side effect of underscoring this theme, right? Of like, Kate is somebody who self-created and is continuing to create the Hawkeye identity more than any other superhero.
Well, I put you on the spot before, and you took us down a really interesting road of 90s music in particular, but I'll ask you on this idea of the series version of this theme, is there a work of film or literature that this reminds you of?
Well, the kind of photo-negative version of this is one of the great all-time TV shows, which is Breaking Bad.
Oh, so good.
Like that whole show, just as this is a very fun show about showing a normal person becoming a hero by choosing to be a hero every single day. Breaking Bad is a story of a normal person who becomes a villain because he just decides to do it, right? And he allows himself a story initially where he was forced to blah, blah, blah. Like, I think a lot of people fall on these crutches when they're choosing a new identity and they don't want to own that that's what they're doing or, a new role or a new thing for themselves, especially if it's negative like that. But as the show goes on, it becomes ever more clear that Walter White did this because he wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He became the one who knocks. And it's an interesting way to think about it because as a photo negative, that show really kind of explored how there's also a lot of attraction that people can have to being bad, and you can turn yourself from a good person into a bad person by just making one bad choice after another. I think most of the time in American culture, we prefer stories of ordinary people becoming heroes because that's uplifting. You're like, Clint, I don't want to be a role model, but I am, And
it's like a metaphor for the American dream, basically.
Yeah. And this is kind of actually telling the truth about a lot of that, right? Sometimes the American dream is being a capitalist monster who destroys other people's lives.
Uh-huh.
I think it's telling,
to put
really.
it simply. Yeah.
It's telling, really, that a lot of viewers never understood that Walter was the villain. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason is that we're so used to the beats of this story of like the person leaving their ordinary life to be an extraordinary person being a hero story that we couldn't, a lot of people just saw the form and just reacted to the form without realizing it was being inverted.
Well, Maeve, you've also brought a lot of interesting ideas to the table for the episode, but I want you now to expand out and look at this series and let us know if there's a theme or main idea you've seen threaded through all 3 episodes so far.
This show is constantly reminding us that it is Christmas time, which, I mean, I'm here for because I love a Christmas movie. But
the music is always something special, man. Speaking of desexualized, how about Gingerbread Man songs, right? There's nothing less sexual than a gingerbread man.
I mean, I don't know about you, but,
does it have to be? You can always make it sexy gingerbread man.
No judging anybody's kinks out there. You know, you like a gingerbread man?
Christine was asking about the choice of that song in the credits, and I didn't have a great answer. I was like, I guess they're fragile like Clint, but maybe it has to do with the desexualization thing. Anyway, I'm getting us off track. It's definitely Christmas time in the show. You were saying.
It is Christmas time, but this show totally sidesteps one really crucial dimension of the classic Christmas movie, namely the nuclear family, right? Like, what's the last time you watched a Christmas movie that wasn't fundamentally at some level about the nuclear family?
Yeah.
Right? It's a Wonderful Life. We're saving the nuclear family. We're getting back to the nuclear family, Home Alone or Scrooged. Or we're realizing that the nuclear family is a lot better than we thought it was.
Okay, but how about like Die Hard? How is Die Hard about the nuclear family?
I mean, Die Hard is about a man going to deal with his children and his ex-wife, and then discovers that he has to save the hostages. So he actually has to save his ex-wife.
And he wants to like get back together with her and like
and get to the kids, right? It's about saving the family.
But isn't that the show? Isn't he trying to get back to his kids?
So here's my feeling about this, that the show could go two ways. It could disappoint me on just this front, that at the end he goes back to his family and everything's the same and blah, 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 right? And so the Christmas movie is fundamentally about the nuclear family here. But I don't think that's where this show is going, because from the beginning of this, regardless of the fact that it is still a Christmas movie, there are Christmas elements everywhere. Christmas trees are being drawn into cars to save them during a car chase. He apologizes to Santa. You know, it begins with Christmas music, right? So there's constantly Christmas being sort of shunted in front of our faces. But the nuclear family is always being pushed to the periphery. So as Christmas is pushed to the center, the nuclear family goes to the periphery. Clint's family is a phone call away. But this is not the, reach out and touch someone of 1980s telecommunications advertising. Like, he can't talk to his son on the phone. He needs Kate there to help him. This is one of those like really touching moments of the episode, the third episode. Their conversation is awkward. It's kind of hollow, except, obviously when he says, I love you more, right? That's a really touching moment, but it's at the periphery of the show. We were talking about his relationship with his wife earlier, right? It's loving, but it's a seeming partnership of equals, but it's not central to the plot.
One of the things that has always been interesting since they introduced Clint's family in Age of Ultron is that they did it at the same time that they introduced the idea that Clint and Natasha are best friends. And this has always been something that a lot of fans just cannot deal with because it doesn't exist in the movies. The idea that a straight man can have both a wife and a female friend, a good female friend, and that there's not a conflict there, and that there's no tension, there's no sexual tension, that his wife isn't jealous. She's not jealous. She names her son after Natasha. She trusts him utterly. So I don't know that I would agree that the nuclear family is shoved to the side. I think that they're trying to do something with Clint where they're trying to tell a story where there's no separate, like, nobody has to choose, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that it's subordinated, and in the standard Christmas film, it's put at the center. It's the thing that we're all trying to save. And here, we're not trying to save it at all. It's fine. Everything's fine. It was sent home, right?
It was not under threat
because it's not under threat. It's going to be fine. He's not his family isn't at risk. His relationship to his family isn't at risk, except insofar as what you've been saying, Amanda, right? Like, he has to struggle with identity questions, but we all do, right? That's not a Christmas problem.
His wife isn't leaving him. His kids aren't mad at him.
And she's totally supportive.
Right. Even if he misses the Christmas deadline, Nate's like, it's cool, okay, Dad. I mean, he's sad. He really wants to be there. But the kids he's not going to lose his family if that happens, right?
And to your point about Natasha, Amanda, there's the wonderful moment in that first episode that really struck me where his daughter says, "She was your best friend." Mm-hmm. And I think that is a perfect formulation of what you're talking about. It pushes away the idea that there could be sexual tension there and formulates it honestly according to what it exactly is, which is dear friendship. She was his best friend.
It's one of those things that's so interesting to me because there's been a lot of research that shows that women in heterosexual relationships tend to have stronger friendship bonds outside of their marriage than men do. Mm. When they ask men and women who their best friend is, women will cite someone outside of the family, and men often say their wife. Like, there's a lot of pressure in our society for men to define love strictly as in nuclear family terms. And I think these kind of movies that you're talking about where you have to save the family and men's heroism is always tied towards saving their family and protecting their family and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Reinscribes this notion that your only legitimate source of emotional connection and support if you're a straight man is a woman you're in a sexual relationship with, and to a lesser degree your children.
And
they're challenging
toxic.
that. Yeah, it's not healthy for men, and it's not healthy for their wives. Like it's soul depleting to just be somebody's only source of emotional support.
Yeah, it's toxic in two senses, right? On the one hand, it's not the right thing, right? We should not only have one person that we go to for everything that we need. And there's been tons of psychological research about this, that it's actually really destructive, the way that we think of the nuclear family as the sole support for our selfhoods. Mm-hmm. We need multiple human beings bolstering our sense of self, giving us alternative expressions of self, right? We can be different people, not radically different people, but we can express different parts of ourselves with our partners and with our friends. There's, like I said, a ton of psychological research about the fact that like this helps us be fuller, more mentally well human beings. But then there's another dimension to it, the sort of toxic masculinity dimension to it, which brings Kate's family into this whole question, right? Because, Kate's mom is trying to marry this dude. And, one way to read that is that, I don't think that she's necessarily trying to do this intentionally, but one way to read that in the context of the Christmas movie is that she's kind of restoring the pillars of the nuclear family. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be a mom and a dad. And Kate's tension with him suggests that that's kind of what the show is thinking about, that this is ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous. But the fact that he's so violent, mm-hmm. and Kate says, well, he must be trying to defend you against Armand. And don't you think that's distressing? And the mom can't see all of that. But one of the consequences of that is it asks us to think about that, the way that the nuclear family positions men as the defenders, the protectors of the home. And that is toxic. Mm-hmm. It's toxic because it makes men into violent figures by role, by their function in the nuclear family. And that's destructive to everybody, including themselves. He's a destroyed human being, that guy. I mean, he's obviously fucked up.
It also, again, asks too much of men. And in the first episode, mm-hmm. we have a scene where Kate asks her dad something, I forget, but he says he will protect her. And then 2 minutes later, he's dead.
Yeah, she says, what are you going to do in a hurricane? And he says, I will protect you.
He can't protect her. He's dead because... He can't. And it's too much. And yeah, I think you're right. The show is doing something super interesting about questioning the nuclear family, not as like an entity, not saying it's bad or poisonous. Clint's family is adorable.
Yeah.
But like, it shouldn't be the end all be, like the way we imagine it is bad.
You just reminded me too that like, this is something that Kate and Maya share. They have fathers who are deeply loving, deeply protective, offering them safety, a sort of a harbor in the universe. And both of them fail not because they fail to be good at what they do. They're both great at what they do, but because circumstance gets the better of them. And so then both of them have to navigate in a universe where the nuclear family and the patriarchal father, not that these two men are necessarily, sort of pillars of patriarchy or whatever, but like in the nuclear family, when the man is supposed to be the protector of the family, that goes away. And so these two women become defenders of themselves very successfully.
Well, and Kate's relationship with her mom might be in for further distress should it turn out that Eleanor is in fact bad news. That would also, I think, play into this idea that, the nuclear family, and we just got to love our immediate family at Christmas time, that this series would be pushing us to think beyond that as a limited constraint of a Christmas time story.
Especially because Kate's mom is a single mom. And that's not the problem, right? The problem isn't that Kate's mom has been forced to raise her by herself. It's because this thing that she does is actually on the side completely of the nuclear family. It has nothing to do with it. She's like out doing something kind of evil, maybe.
I'm just saying, as a daughter who, cares about justice, you might feel betrayed if your mom turns out to be some kind of supervillain, perhaps with a mask.
Yeah, you know what, Mark, I have a question for you. So, in the context of all of this, right, the Christmas story, relegating the nuclear family to the periphery of this particular Christmas story, it had me thinking about something we talked about a couple weeks ago, namely found families. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to reckon with this. Like, how do we square the idea that the nuclear family is being kind of pushed to the periphery? I don't know. Is something different happening here? I mean, what's your take on this? Because you were talking about that, and I feel like you've got a good take on this, probably.
Yeah, I would say that I think this plays into your idea about us reimagining the Christmas time story as something about more than just the nuclear family. The most obvious example is Echo and Uncle, who will, of course, almost certainly turn out to be Wilson Fisk, a man with whom she probably has a tremendous amount of trust. He's been there for her since she was a child. They have no blood relations, and yet that relationship, we might just be at the beginning of that. He could be deeply involved in her whole series. Who knows? There's going to be a lot of found family story between those two. Kate and Clint, one way to describe what is developing between them is obviously something about found family. I think Pizza Dog's relationship with Kate is very much along the same lines of found family. So I do think the episode is actually building on that idea, and that idea also builds on what you're saying here.
I think Clint's journey is obviously going to be learning what Kate has already learned and decided is true for herself, which is that this familial relationship with Kate that he's developing is equal to his relationship with his biological children.
Yeah. There's that moment in the diner where she says, I can't pay for that. You're going to have to cover this because my mom took away my credit card. And he says, I've got this. And as a daughter of a father, it felt like something that my dad would say. Like, I've got this. Yeah. It felt like a dad thing to say. I've got this.
I think if her mom is evil, she's going to need him more than ever. And he is going to recognize, I think it's not just that he's going to recognize he has a duty to step up. I think he's going to find it a pleasure and a joy too, because the show is clearly underscoring that his nuclear family, while wonderful, is not enough. He needed Natasha. She died. He now needs somebody outside of his family, and Kate is going to be it. And I think that's great. I would love for the show to be like, your protege is as important as your children. That doesn't make your children less important. It's just like saying that all of these relationships count.
Yeah, that's great. Maeve, does this concept of moving beyond the nuclear family in this story, does it remind you of something else in film or literature?
There is a ton of feminist writing from second wave on, arguably, that is really interested in kind of dismantling the nuclear family. And we've talked a lot on this show, or I have talked a lot about Shulamith Firestone, because she's a giant, I'm a fan girl, can't help myself. One of her kind of crucial arguments in The Dialectic of Sex, which she publishes in 1976, I think, is that the origin of patriarchy coincides with the elevation of the nuclear family as the kind of primary unit of social organization. She argues that once the nuclear family becomes the way that we think about how society is structured, and it is done so in the service of patriarchy, because it always relegates women to the role of maternal figures, allying it to some conception that this is natural because they're capable of bearing children, sort of completely sidestepping the fact that they can't do it literally by themselves. But the fact that they carry a child to term and birth that child, then somehow they're responsible for that child in its entirety. And of course, we are literally seeing that play out in our lives right now. This idea that women are the sole, that children are the sole responsibility of women, and that women's maternal roles define them and allow us to regulate and control them. But Shulamith Firestone is interesting on this front. I think that there's another writer more contemporary to us, written some work more recently that I think is really helpful on this front. And it's Sophie Lewis, who is a philosopher, fairly young philosopher. She is a fairly harsh critic of Shulamith Firestone, but I think she's not wrong. She's not saying that this isn't true. There is a historical truth that the nuclear family and patriarchy come up together in the world, but and she is committed to the idea that the nuclear family is bad for women. It's just bad for women because it relegates women to the household. It creates distinctions between male and female roles that constrain women's possibilities. But she wants something even more radical. She wants to banish the family entirely because, and I think this is a kind of logical idea that if the nuclear family and patriarchy are co-reliant on one another, then if you destroy one, you might actually be able to destroy the other. And her argument, very, very briefly, is very different from Shulamith Firestone. Firestone has this like weird technological, fantastical argument that if we could get birthing chambers, women wouldn't have to give birth. And actually, I'm a little bit more partial to that idea because it's actually possible, but I'm not sure we could actually do that in the world we live in. Sophie Lewis's argument is that we need to legalize surrogacy.
Ooh.
So it's really interesting, actually, because what she says is that if we legalize surrogacy, we would make it labor, we would make it work. And if we made it work, we could regulate it. We could build laws around it. And it's super controversial, but it's interesting because her argument is that if you decouple a woman's body from maternity and treat it as work that can be paid, then all women's work in the home is worthy of pay. And if that is true, then we start to kind of disintegrate the core distinctions that are inside the nuclear family.
Well, I don't think you're going to find that discussion on any other Marvel TV podcast, gang. On that note, let's wrap it up, you guys. Maeve, if people want to talk to you more about the destruction of the nuclear family and whether surrogacy should be an occupation, where can they find and follow you?
I mean, please do come and talk to me about that because I am deeply invested in this conversation. At Maeve Adams on Twitter, I'm there.
And Amanda, where can people find and follow you?
You can find me at Amanda Marcotte on Twitter, and you can always read me at salon.com.
Okay, Audio Avengers, that's our show for today. There's usually a lot of surprises in store for us in the 4th episode of a Marvel series, and we will be back with Character Cast next week to dive into all of that. So look for Jesse, Christine, and I next week, episode 4 of Hawkeye. If you are enjoying this show, please leave us a 5-star Apple review so we can rise in those search rankings. It means so much to us. And if you want to talk to me some more, you can find me at the Marvelous TV Club Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter, all at Marvelous TV Club. And of course, I'm Marc Faletti. That's Mark with a C, F as in Frank, Aletti, on Twitter as well. Until next time, gang, let's hang off some weird arrows.